It's lovely to be in Durham. As is absolutely traditional for political leaders, when I arrived here, got out of the train station and met a journalist, they said, "What do you think of Durham?" But being well prepared on these things and actually having walked a little bit through Durham, I said, well, you've definitely got, having seen the castle on the hill, which I'm told is one of the student cottages, you definitely have a better class of student accommodation than we mostly have in London. Because I just, actually with my local Green Party, was trying to fight with local development, which is a 28-storey tower block of rabbit hutches, which is student accommodation for £300 a week for an 11 square metre room. So, you know, whatever you've got here, whatever you're paying looks pretty good in comparison. You also have here in Durham the extremely good taste to be on the East Coast Main Line. And I say that with a particular passion because yesterday he was going to the West Midlands, which has the misfortune, I'm sure they didn't choose it this way, to have Virgin trains. And it's just so lovely to get onto the East Coast Main Line. And it's partly because it's a lovely train line by comparison, but it's also that knowledge that the East Coast Main Line is publicly owned, publicly run. And it's actually the most profitable train line in the country. And that's very topical because this week, and I urge you to think about visiting the 38 Degree website and Googling or searching for Keep East Coast Main Line Public, because on Friday, your signature could be joining tens of thousands of others in a petition that's being presented to Parliament by the Green MP Caroline Lucas to say, keep the East Coast Main Line public. And it's a big issue this week. The whole train lines is really in the news this week also because of another action of Caroline Lucas, because this week is the second reading of her private member's bill before Parliament, which goes a lot further than saying keep the East Coast Main Line public. It says return all of our railways to public ownership. And you'll be hearing a bit later about an event that's been happening locally on Friday morning. And you know, if you think that's a good idea, and I can assure you it is, it would save us £1 billion a year to start off with, and we could get a joined up integrated railway system again, then do think about coming along to that event on Friday morning. So I could talk a lot about trains, but I'm going to park trains for the moment and talk about what's, I think, probably to most people in this room, a really critically important issue of intergenerational justice. The state of the way things are in Britain today, the Britain that you're facing, that you're getting into, that you're going to have to tackle. And it was actually, I've had to work quite hard on this because it did get a bit depressing when I started to put all of this together, about what we, as the older generations collectively, have left you facing, have put you through. And I started with schools. Now I'm a school governor in a primary serving a very poor area of central London. And what horrifies me is how much, from a very young age, we're forcing our children through exams, treating the whole schooling system like a sausage machine. Here's the next exam, ram, ram, ram. You've got to get over the standard 4 in this exam. And it starts so early. You know, at the end of year 1 now, pupils are being tested on phonics. And I know lots of teachers who think phonics are an absolute load of nonsense, but Michael Gove has dictated it, so they've got no choice but to go with the phonics option. And, you know, there was great excitement that the pass rate for these 5 and 6-year-olds had gone up to 68% in the most recent set of exams. And that means 32% of those kids failed. And they know they've been called pupils who failed. And at age 5 or 6, that is an absolute disgrace. And I know lots of parents, lots of teachers are doing their utmost to protect those kids from that. But, you know, kids know, and that's a label that is going to hang with too many of them for way too long. And that's the way things are with our whole schooling system. And one of the other things that's perhaps less obvious, but I think equally important, I've been doing a lot of, with the university year starting, I've been doing a lot of university events. I actually did a Southwest Youth Parliament event last weekend. And one of the things that I find young people are saying to me is that what schools really aren't providing is what you might call life education. I was at Bournemouth University and there was a very good study there done by one of their graduate students about asking why young people weren't voting. And huge numbers of them said, well, it's because we've got a real problem with we don't really understand what it's all about, we don't understand the systems, we're not quite sure what to do when we go in there, and it all looks too difficult, and people just aren't voting for that reason. And what they were saying, what that room was saying very strongly, was we want decent political education. There's financial and banking education. Now, I don't know how much education you got about that when you were in school, but lots of people say, they leave school and suddenly you've got to manage your finances, and no one's really told you how it works, how an overdraft works, how the whole system fits together. There's sex and relationship education. There's cooking and food growing education. Now, I doubt that student cookery has ever been famous for its culinary qualities. But I think many pupils, are leaving school having had no education in cooking at all. And because we're going through a couple of generations of that, maybe their parents didn't have much idea either. And so we're not giving people the life skills that they actually need in terms of education. And then, of course, there's the financial aspects of college and higher education. I did actually ask the Youth Parliament, because EMA got abolished a couple of years ago. Did you still know what EMA was, the Education Maintenance Allowance? And what I got back was a very definite yes, and we want it back. And we think that's absolutely right, because once you get past compulsory education, once you're at a point where your parents, might be starting to think that it was up to you to support yourself, but you want to stay in education, lots of people need help to do that. And lots of people shouldn't be in situations where they're struggling to hold down difficult part-time jobs just to get by, just to pay their fares to college, to pay their fares to early university, all of those kind of things without the EMA. And then, of course, I get to the biggie, tuition fees. I always have to stop and pause and make sure everyone's listening at this point, just so they believe it. The Green Party believes in zero tuition fees. Zero. We think that education is a public good, and that should be paid for out of the public purse, out of taxation. And so what you should not be doing is leaving university with a great weight of debt sitting on your shoulder. Now, I don't know how many people here have done the maths, and I'm sorry if I'm about to shock anyone who hasn't, but the statistics show that on average pupils, students in England leaving university are likely to leave with about £60,000 worth of debt, very large numbers of them. That's with the university tuition fees we have now and living costs. Now, when you speak to people who support our current level of tuition fees, or even the Labour Party policy of £6,000 a year instead, they say, oh, it's all right because lots of people will never pay it back. And I really don't believe that's an acceptable thing to say. Because that means for 30 years, the 30 years of your life, the biggest years of your life when they've got some of the biggest expenditures in your life, you'll have the weight of that debt sitting on your shoulder, weighing you down, knowing that if your salary goes up, the tuition fee loan's going to be sucked back out of it. And I just think that's absolutely not an appropriate place for you to be forced to be starting life in. And of course, what many students are doing, and I hear people talk to me about it, is they're working through the university course to try and keep that figure down. And, I worked through university myself. I actually had what will sound to you like a very curious student job. Once upon a time, people were paid their pay packets in cash. You actually had little brown envelopes and you got that money in cash. And I used to have a job from midnight to dawn, one day a week, counting out pay packets. It wasn't a very exciting student job, I'd have to say, but it actually paid quite well. And so I used to do that, and that helped me get through university. But I also know that I very often, on Thursday mornings after I'd been working straight through the night, it was when the lecturer switched the lights out in the lecture theatre. It was hopeless. I was always going to fall asleep because I hadn't been to sleep the night before. And that wasn't great for my education, at least in that particular subject. And, combining education and work at the same time is tough. And it means that you're missing out on lots of stuff that maybe you haven't got as much time to do: sport, cultural activities, social activities. And, I think students should be able to concentrate on being students. So that's, where we're at. What would we like to do in the Green Party instead? We think there's lots of really positive alternatives. We want a system that isn't focused on exams, but is focused on learning. That doesn't shove people through endless, non-stop exams, one after the other, but that has some exams. I think I've passed some subjects where I've passed the exam without actually knowing very much about the subject at all, and sometimes you do that. I wouldn't recommend it, but it can be done. And sometimes, but we shouldn't have that focus on exams. There should be coursework. There should be just learning. We don't believe in free schools and academies because we think we should have community-controlled schools that have the general oversight and that shouldn't and are unlikely to collapse. And one of the things we've seen with several free schools recently, most notably Al Medina in Derby, is it's fallen apart. And the pupils of that school, they're almost certainly going to have to go to another school, and that's going to disrupt both their education and also the education of all the pupils in those surrounding schools. And the idea that we can have a system that, we'll experiment with lots of things and some things will fail, I think is a really bad idea for the pupils at those schools. So that's a brief summation. No free schools, no academies, a return to some form of EMA, and zero tuition fees. That's a very short summary of schooling time. But of course, most of you will already be thinking about, or soon be thinking about, going out into the workplace. And you probably don't need me to tell you that it's pretty tough out there. We have nearly 1 million young people unemployed, and we have on far too many young people an expectation that your first job won't be a job, it'll be an internship, an unpaid internship, and quite likely your second job or your third job will be too. And what happened to the idea of starter jobs, the first job that you get out of university? They've all too often been replaced by unpaid internships, and we don't think companies should be allowed to get away with that. And we think we've really got to restructure our economy to create those starter jobs again. I used to be the editor of The Guardian Weekly, the international edition of The Guardian, and it horrified me because I used to get, several times a week, young people coming to me saying they were desperate to come to work for me for nothing. These were usually young people with 1 master's and sometimes 2, with 2 or 3 languages, with a year or 2's experience of working unpaid as interns, very often in horribly exploitative situations for like 6 months at a time, doing what was a job by any name except for the fact it wasn't paid. And they were begging to come and work for me for nothing. And that is absolutely an unacceptable situation. And of course there are paid jobs out there, but one of the things that you might not know is that 1 in 5 jobs in the whole of Britain pays less than a living wage. That's 20% of jobs. Now, the national minimum wage is £6.19 an hour. The national minimum living wage is £7.45 an hour. There's about £1.30 an hour difference. And that's the difference between the living wage is calculated to give you a basically decent standard of living. Nothing luxurious, nothing flashy, but the basics, essentials. And yet people are not being paid enough to live on. And 1 in 10 people, a tenth of British workers, are working fewer hours than they'd like to. Now that means people are being forced into casual jobs when they want full-time jobs. They need jobs that they can build a life on, but they're instead getting things like Next, the GMB union did a study, and Next, 97% of the jobs they were offering were 12.5 hours a week or less contracts. National minimum wage, which when you put those 2 figures together produces a magic total, it's less than the national insurance minimum. So Next wasn't paying any national insurance for those jobs. And that's not the sort of job that you can build a life on. And then of course there's 0 hours contracts. Now, does everyone know what 0 hours contracts are? Okay, I'm getting the odd shake of the head. Very briefly, it means that you're contracted to be available for your employer for a certain number of hours, often 40 hours a week, but you're not guaranteed any hours in any particular week. So the classic case of this, and I was actually at Oxford University talking to some pretty privileged students people who looked like they were going to do pretty well in life, but one of them was telling me his friend who'd left the previous year had a 0 hours contract, and was getting a phone call at 6 a.m. every morning to be told whether they'd have work that day. So they had to be awake and ready to go at 6 o'clock, and there might be work that day or there might not be. And that's, sadly, I'm afraid, the kind of workplace that your work experience that you're likely to find when you go out there into the workplace. Low pay, forced casualisation, and 0 hours contracts. And what I would say to you and what the Green Party believes is that that's not the kind of thing that we can or should be building Britain's economic future on. We come back to the point that Britain is the world's 6th richest country. It mightn't often feel like that, it mightn't often be talked about very much, but I think it is worth focusing on. We are the 6th richest country in the world, and yet we have 500,000 people today, at this moment, who are dependent on food banks to survive. So what we say as the Green Party is our current economic structures simply aren't working. They're not delivering the kind of future that you need to build your future in. Globalisation, neoliberalism, the privatisation, like the privatisation of our railways, simply hasn't delivered the kind of economy that you need to build the future on. And of course, there's also the other great issue brought into relief by the IPCC report a couple of weeks ago, that in Britain today, as in most of the developed world, we're living far beyond our environmental means. In Britain, every year, we all collectively, no matter how good you personally try to be, we all collectively use the resources of 3 planets. But we've only got 1 planet. So what we have to do is cut back. But of course we can't say to the whole of our society, you've all got to cut back. You've got those people dependent on food banks, you've got those people living in fuel poverty who are switching the heating off in midwinter and shivering because they're worried about the bill. You've got a situation where some people, the multinational companies, the rich individuals, have got to pay their fair share of taxes, not dump their profits in tax havens, and cut back a lot. And some people at the bottom of society actually have to be lifted up. And many of those people are young people who are out there really struggling. What we have to do is rebuild a different kind of society, a different kind of economy. We've got big multinational companies, which are very often the ones with the 0 hours contract and the minimum wages. And we think what we have to do instead is rebuild our economy, bring manufacturing and food production back to Britain, and restore small businesses, restore cooperatives, local economies, so that money in somewhere like Durham goes round and round in the local economy, instead of being spent in the nearest big supermarket, possibly through a self-service till. And next time you sort of walk up to the self-service till, think about the fact there's maybe 1 staff member overseeing 6 or 8 self-service tills, and that's 7 jobs gone. So you put that money, say you're buying a £1 bag of apples in the big supermarket, you put the money through that self-service till, and a couple of pence of it maybe stay here in Durham, and the rest swooshes off away, quite likely into the nearest tax haven. But if you instead have an economy built around small businesses, local shops, and you buy that bag of apples from a local greengrocer, say, and if you're really lucky, maybe it came from an orchard, she bought it from an orchard just down the road. And then when she needs a new sign, she employs a local sign writer. When she does her books, she employs a local accountant. When she needs some new shelves, she employs a local carpenter. And you think about how money can go round and round in local economies, being shared around all sorts of different businesses, all sorts of different jobs, in a way that our globalised multinational company structures simply haven't managed to achieve. And so, what I would say for your future is we really need to radically change Britain. And one of the things that when I say this to people, actually I had a very nice man who runs a bicycle shop yesterday in Malvern Hills said to me, "Oh, you're absolutely right, but it's never going to happen, it's just too radical." Well, I'll tell you about a survey that the Fabian Society did. It was a survey that's representative of the whole of Britain. And the whole of the British public in this survey were presented with a statement that said, "Our economic model is broken and we need to radically change it." And you know what? 67% of people agreed with that statement in that survey. 67% of people agreed that our economic model is broken. And only 15% of people actually disagreed. So I think there is a very strong awareness out there and a knowledge that you, all of us, are going to have to build a different kind of world. They're going to have to restructure things. They're going to have to do things very differently in the future. So when I was thinking about this talk and thinking I really must not be too depressing because there's lots of things to say about how bad things are, well, the positive thing is we are going to have to change. And that has a real opportunity to change things in new kind of directions, to build a very different sort of society, a very different kind of culture. And one of the things that we might like to think about in rebuilding that change is our focus on GDP growth. Now, one of the fascinating things about our focus on growth, and the figures that come out every quarter and there's big concerns, is GDP up or down, is actually, if you go back to the people who invented the measure GDP, they wrote when they did it some very clear instructions. They said, this figure must not be used to measure national progress. This is a really bad figure for measuring national progress. So what have we been doing for the decades since the Second World War? Using GDP to measure national progress. Now, just a little illustration on the problems with GDP for national progress. This is Caroline Lucas, the Green MP's favourite example. If a parent takes their young child out for dinner at Dunkin' Donuts, that's good for GDP. If they make a nice vegetable stew from the back garden, that's bad for GDP. Or, the other classic example, you have a big crash out on the motorway. Lots of cars to repair, cars to replace, people to patch up. That's good for GDP, when it's clearly not good for the people or the society. Or one final example, because this is my favourite old feminist one, and this rather dates itself, but a man marries his housekeeper. GDP goes down because she's not getting paid anymore. So GDP is a nonsense measure. And what I'd like to really finish with and leave you with a suggestion of how we might really structure things differently, how you might think about how you want to structure our world differently. The New Economics Foundation has been doing some great work on the issue of working hours and how much time we do spend in paid work. Now, Green Party policy says that we'd like to reduce the standard working week to 35 hours as a starting point. But the New Economics Foundation goes a lot further. And they put out a paper a few years ago, which they've now turned into a book, exploring it much further, that suggests we might reduce the standard working time in a week gradually down to 21 hours a week. And what that means is that you'd have much more time in your life, time to spend with family and friends, time to spend with hobbies, time even for some of us to spend on politics. And if we started to think about how we might look at progress in a new kind of way, we've got a living wage that ensures everyone's getting enough and decent benefits for people for whom the living wage isn't available. We've probably got less stuff in our life. We might be doing flying off for fewer weekends to Prague. But what we get is time. And maybe for progress, each year we say knock 15 minutes off the standard working week. Every 4 years you get an extra hour a week in your life. And that might be an alternative way of looking at real progress towards a better world. A world in which everyone's getting enough and you have the opportunity to actually live within the limits of one planet and really live well, live a good life, and everyone living a good life. I'm going to finish there. Thank you very much. Now, what we're going to do with the rest of the structure of this, we're going to talk a little bit about the European elections and a local election coming up, and then it'll come back to me for questions, so you can think about the questions. But I'm going to hand over to Shirley Ford now, who's our lead European candidate in this area. Okay, so now we get to the Q&A bit, which is your chance to ask me anything at all, either about what I said or any other stuff, anything political at all.
You talked a lot about that you wanted the economic situation in Britain to change. Mm-hmm. What would you do to make that happen?
Okay, starting point is, as I said, make the minimum wage a living wage. That's a simple statutory step. And it's interesting, I do a lot of the kind of canvassing we were just been talking about, including in parts of North London where people people live in, houses worth 6, 10, whatever million. And I say to them, don't you think if someone works full-time they should earn enough money to live on? And even people in those houses kind of go, well, yeah. And because actually what's happened was, over 13 years of a Labour government, a period of time in which inequality actually increased in Britain, what happened was that the minimum wage was kept low and people were enabled to live primarily through housing benefit and family tax credit. And what that actually was corporate welfare. Because, a basic requirement of a member of staff is that they should be able to live. That's, be living mightn't be in the job description, but it's kind of assumed. And yet if you're not paying your staff member enough money to live on, then actually the government's got to supplement it. That's corporate welfare. So what we would do first of all is raise the minimum wage to the living wage and end that corporate welfare. And interestingly, that also saves the government about £4 billion a year in terms of both extra tax payments and in cuts to family credit and housing benefit. What we'd also do, and it's interesting because when I used to say this in 2010, it was a really radical thing. Make multinational companies and rich individuals pay their taxes. And back in 2010 when I said that, I got journalists doing that kind of thing the plumber does when he looks at the boiler. You can't say that, the journalists would say to me, that's too radical, British people will never vote for making multinational companies pay and rich individuals pay their taxes. And interestingly, of course, a year or so back we had David Cameron on the steps of Davos saying, we're going to make multinational companies pay their taxes. However, unfortunately, his actions haven't matched up with his words. It was just out today, actually, War on Want did an excellent report that showed that Boots, the high street chemist, since it went private 6 years ago, has avoided more than £1 billion in tax. And then, of course, I'm sure you all know the Amazon, the Starbucks, the Google, the long trail of companies that are making huge amounts of money out of Britain and paying a tiny fraction of the taxes that they should be paying. So what we would say is make multinational companies pay their taxes. And that gives us money to provide the essential public services that are now being cut. The libraries and the Sure Start centres, all of the essential services that we all in one way or another rely on that are being cut at the moment. And then when you're starting to think a bit more radical and a bit more in terms of really reshaping the economy, I'd invite you to think about that £5 t-shirt that you can probably buy on the high street store somewhere out there, and think about the kind of history of that £5 t-shirt and where it's all come from. And very likely it might have started in a field of cotton in Azerbaijan, being picked by a 10-year-old who should have been in school but was forced out of school into the fields. It's then used fossil fuels to ship that cotton over to China, where it's spun into cloth, very likely in a factory that's spewing its waste dye straight out into the river without any treatment at all. Then it's shipped down perhaps to a Bangladeshi garment factory. And I think at the moment need to tell anyone about conditions in Bangladeshi garment factories. You probably all know about the Rana Plaza collapse. What you mightn't know, there was just a couple of days ago, there was another factory fire in which 7 people died. And then you've got fossil fuel again, shipping it back here to Britain and onto the Durham High Street. Now if you think about the real cost of that £5 t-shirt, it's actually not £5 or anything like £5. And one of the things we need to do is make sure that all of those externalised costs, those carbon emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions, the exploitation of the 10-year-old, of the garment workers, all of those factors are actually built into the real cost of that t-shirt. And what we'd like to eventually do is replace that with what I think an academic suggested to me recently, I think is a nice idea, what you can call damage taxes. Revenue neutral, not increasing tax in total, but just making sure that you're starting to actually get the real cost of something included in the price. And if you do that, then that's really how you start to see how you really reshape the economy to actually reflect the real costs of what things are. And maybe you can, grow some hemp in a field in Kent, spin it here sew it in a factory down the road and sell it here for a price that's going to compete with that t-shirt when it's got its real cost on it. So that's the kind of reshaping that we need to do. What we also need to do is look at the way in which multinational companies exploit us in all kind of ways that aren't necessarily related directly either to their employment practices or to their failure to pay tax. We had a pop-up shop in Camden Green Party during the London election opposite one of those little Sainsbury local stores. And what it did was they don't have a storeroom. They operate on the just-in-time delivery. So an HGV grew up into this little suburban street 3 or 4 times a day. And it was parked outside in that little suburban street, taking up 3 or 4 car spaces. And they unloaded straight onto the pavement. And because they didn't have a storeroom, they left all the trolleys that were unloaded and loaded off the truck sitting on the pavement. And because they never quite knew when the HGV was turning up, they coned off that space outside the shop, totally illegally, but they just stuck the cones out. And for a while we played a little game where we put the cones away and they put the cones out again, but it got a bit boring in the end. But companies like those big supermarkets, in all kind of ways, are stealing public space. They used to unload regularly at 3 o'clock in the morning, which was not so delightful for the hundreds of people who lives in flats above those shops. So we've allowed big multinational companies to get away in all sorts of ways with making our lives much worse. We've got to actually say, no, you have to be a decent corporate citizen, you have to behave in a proper way. And when we do that, then small companies will start to be able to compete with them much more effectively. So what we've really got to do is level that playing field back up. Sorry, that was a very long answer, I'm not going to make them all that long. Okay, other questions? Yep.
Hi, I was just asking about foreign trade.
Mm-hmm.
Firstly, would a Green Britain still be a member of the European Free Trade Zone? Also, would a Green Britain mandate trade through Britain from areas like Africa and South America to abide by some kind of fair trade laws?
Well, first of all, I've talked a lot about local economies and bringing food production and manufacturing back to Britain. It's worth being clear that I'm not talking about autarky or anything like total self-reliance. I like my morning coffee. I even like the odd banana, and I don't want to give either of those up, and we're not going to grow either of those in Britain anytime soon. But what we would do is, yes, I mean, that damage tax means that if you're not engaging in fair trade, you're looking at the costs there, then you're putting punitive damage taxes on, so you're enforcing fair trade. But I think you've got to be really careful, and when I talk about, reducing things like stopping flying beans from Kenya and peas from Peru and that, everyone says, oh, but what about their local economies? But they need to develop strong local economies with money going round and round them just like we do, because the kind of trade that we've seen, the Kenyan cut flour trade is notorious for the kind of ecological damage and economic damage it's done to Kenya. Lots of those kind of trades haven't been very positive for people. In terms of Europe, we believe in staying in the EU. We would very much like to see the EU very significantly reformed, but what the EU can do very effectively is provide a foundation of standards. EU can set standards for workers' rights, standards for consumer rights. Now, okay, they didn't do terribly well with horse meat, but I'm sure they can do better than that in future. Standards of human rights, all kind of standards that the EU can and should set as a baseline. And that means neighbouring countries can't burrow underneath the others and undercut the standards for everybody. And one of the advantages is that Europe is a very big market, and so if Europe sets those standards, then what you can do is actually very much try and make those the global standards that apply to everything. So there's a real value in the EU with that. Okay. Yep.
As one of the few women leaders in politics, what would you say to the women who are a bit deterred by politics and how they would get into it?
Yeah. Well, I do have to start by saying that, and I think it's really telling that we had to get to 2012 to this point, that I'm the first woman leader of a political party to take over from another woman. That has never happened in British politics before, and the fact that we had to get to 2012 for that is really telling. And, politics as a woman is in some ways more difficult than it is for a guy. you know, I'd have to say that's a matter of honesty. I mean, I'm relatively lucky in that because I don't have children, I haven't got all those care kind of issues that often make it really difficult. And, you know, I actually do, you know, I believe in a work-life balance. I just don't actually have one. And, you know, if I had children, that would be extremely difficult. But the answer really is, you know, and also the other thing is, you know, I spend a lot of time thinking about my appearance in an attempt to ensure that no one ever comments on my appearance. And that's something that if I were a male politician wouldn't be the same kind of issue. But what I would say to women is, come in here and join me because we have to change how it works. You know, sometimes I do have to play, you know, I have to slang it out with Andrew Neil on the daily politics and play those kind of games, and I can play those kind of games. But ultimately, we don't want politics to be about PMQs, football score, how many points did David Cameron get versus how many points did Ed Miliband get, who told their jokes best. That's really not what politics is all about. And the more women we get in there, you know, cases around the world, Scandinavian politics where there are, you know, a lot of women, you know, if we can get in there and change the culture and do it differently, and that means sometimes struggling and fighting along the way, but, you know, it's really important that we do it. And I say that not because I believe there's any kind of essentialist difference between men and women, but we have different experiences. We have different concerns that arise out of our experiences. And, you know, I actually got into politics, my first politics was feminism. And the first experience that informed that feminism was at age 5. I was told that I wasn't allowed to have a bicycle because I was a girl. And although I didn't know the word feminism then, that was when I became a feminist. And that's, you know, the kind of experience that we've all had, you know, being very concerned about issues like contraceptive access and abortion rights and all of those kind of issues. You know, there's no reason why men can't be concerned about them too, but we bring our personal experiences to them. And, you know, we have now 22% female MPs. And that is a disgracefully low figure. And it's not going to be much better in the next parliament. And, you know, I'd like to think there's some people in this room who will help to make it better in future.
Absolutely. And can I just say, so as well as myself and Caroline, Jo is also on our European candidate list, aren't you, Jo? And Alison Worley from North Tyneside is also on. So 4 out of the 5, and that's without a quota. And I think that says a lot about our culture, our political culture of how we operate in the Green Party. That as a woman, as a feminist, I feel very, you know, respected and valued, and I hope my comrades feel that way as well. And that having started to be a political activist as a student on things like anti-apartheid and CND, those things. There are some places that are more open in a political culture than other traditional political cultures, like when I attempted to be active in the Labour Party after university and found that it was an extremely unpleasant experience. So, yeah, I think they're definitely, you know, this is part of the green political culture, so definitely.
Mm-hmm. Yep, so get involved, yep.
Yeah.
Although, excuse me, although I agree very much with the sentiment about the damage tax idea, on the one hand I see this damage tax as pushing, obviously it's terrible about when you think about that £5 t-shirt, but also when you think about our people at the very bottom who are struggling and not getting that living wage, are also depending on that for clothing. You put on the damage tax and you legislate through a living wage of £7.45, how is that going to cope with the new increase in the commodity price?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, the living wage is calculated every year. So, you know, that's one of the things that, you know, people often say to me, why don't you come up with a really simple solution like UKIP? UKIP says we can get out of Europe and stop immigration and everything will be sweetness and light. I don't have quite such simple solutions to things as that. You know, these are all packages of things that fit together. So the living wage and, you know, a restructured economy with decent local jobs and, you know, jobs again for the local accountant and all the rest of it, all of that fits together with the damage taxes. And, you know, we have to be realistic about this when we come back to the 3 planets. You know, we're using 3 planets' resources worth of stuff. So what we might need is the £20 shirt that lasts 10 times as long as we all know the £5 t-shirt lasts for 3 washes and then ends up looking like a rag. So we need things to last longer. I mean, I was horrified recently to see an advert on the tube in London that said, from a certain mobile phone company, change your phone whenever you like. And actually, we don't really need to change our phone every year or 2 years or 3 years, which doesn't mean we can't improve it, but you could download a software upgrade or plug a new chip in the side. So we do have to move towards what's known in the jargon as a circular economy, using a lot less stuff. And some of the things will be more expensive, but they'll last an awful lot longer. So it's an entirely different structural kind of economy. Yep. Oh, yep, gentleman middle.
Hi. How do you think the Green Party can produce the groundswell of popular support that will get it represented significantly at the national level?
Mm-hmm. I'd love to know your thoughts on this, but it's very frustrating. I mean, there's a website called Vote for Policies, which puts unbranded the policies from the last general election, and you know what? We win that election. We have something like, last time I saw it, still ongoing, something like 24%. We won that election. What we have in Britain, though, is what I'd call the dinosaur remnants of the old 2 or 2.5 party system. People have been trained over decades to vote for the person they dislike the second most, so the person they dislike the most doesn't get in. But I think what we are at is a point now where things are about to break wide open. And I can't tell you exactly where or when that's going to happen. The rise of UKIP is part of it. The vote on not going to war in Syria that recently happened in Parliament is another part of it, when actually the parties broadly broke apart quite strongly. And lots of Tory people voted against, the Tory MPs voted against going to war in Syria. So, that 2-party system clearly has failed. We're heading into something new and different. Basically, as I've had lots of people from Green Party say to me, from around the country say to me, if everyone who said to me, I'd vote Green but you can't win, just voted Green, then we'd win. But there is something very important and different that's going to be different in 2015 that wasn't true in 2010. That's 2015's the next general election. Because in 2010, I stood in Holborn and St Pancras, where I live in central London, and we had 10 hustings. It's a very political kind of place. These are when all the candidates get called in together in a room like this, and you all answer questions from the public. So we did 10 of these, which meant I got to know my 3 fellow candidates, and particularly the Tory, much better than I ever wanted to get to know anybody, really. But what happened in that 2010 general election was people went, oh, isn't it nice? The Green's really interesting, and she speaks lots of sense. And the local paper said, gosh, the Green won that debate. Isn't that nice? But I couldn't say in 2010, if you elect me as your MP, I will do this, this, and this, because everyone would have just laughed in 2010. But 2015 will be different, because in 2010 we elected Caroline Lucas as the first Green MP in Brighton Pavilion. And we've shown it's possible. It can be done. And so I can say next time to Holborn and St Pancras, and your candidate here in Durham, your candidate wherever you might be in 2015 will be able to say, Brighton Pavilion did it, Durham can do it too. And that makes 2015 profoundly different for us than any previous general election. So, I don't have a magic formula, I don't have a magic recipe, but there's huge possibilities out there. Okay. All right, I'm seeing lots of male hands, and I'm going to take one more of those, and I'd quite like to see a female hand right over there.
I was wondering about your policy on housing and building new houses, because obviously we're told quite often that there isn't enough housing for people, and then you have this dichotomy between building more houses to house people and protecting the countryside, because much of this might be built on green land. Do you think there's enough brownfield sites for us to build on those, or renovate existing housing stuff, or do you think we need to cut immigration simply for the fact that our country can't support an indefinite number of people and still have a good environment to live in?
I'll start with 2 points. One, there are nearly 1 million empty houses in Britain. 2, there are now more bedrooms per person in Britain than we've ever had before. And when we talk about housing shortage, you've got to look at both of those contexts. And the key factors for both of those, the 1 million empty homes, is regional development policy, or the failure to have any regional development policy. Now, Durham clearly is a place that's doing quite well, but there's lots of places in the north and the Midlands that aren't doing very well. And I mean, I've been on the Wirral in streets of houses that are just basically deserted, perfectly good houses, nothing wrong with them, but just no one wants to live there because there's no economic opportunities there. So, first of all, we actually need to very much restructure the economy of Britain away from that focus on the southeast. And one of the important things we have to do is not build HS2, because HS2 will actually focus economic development even more on London. And without digressing fully into HS2, just one figure, 72% of the journeys on their own statistics would be people going into London. So anyone who tells you this will spread money and people out from London, just quote that figure back at them. So regional development policy, and that more bedrooms per person than ever before, is a function of inequality, of rising inequality. And if you start to cut inequality, you start to balance that up. I mean, the part of London I live in, we're seeing terraced houses that have been, 4 or 5 flats, or sometimes even 2 terraced houses that have been 4 or 5 flats, that are being knocked into one house, and they're installing a double basement so that they can have the real essentials of a home cinema and a swimming pool in their double basement. So, the inequality is a big issue on that. Nonetheless, even taking all of those 2 factors into account, there are parts of Britain where we need more houses. But what we need more houses on is those brownfield sites. And there nearly always are enough of those, because what's happening at the moment is the builders far too often say to the council, oh yeah, there's a brownfield site over there, but our profits aren't big enough, we've got to go and build on the green belt. And if your profits are only 10% on the brownfield versus 20% on the green belt, well, tough. And the other thing that we desperately need to do is build much more council housing, because that's one of the really foundational facts. And actually when people, particularly in London and in some of the other parts of the country that feel very crowded, people who say to me on the doorstep, oh, I'm anti-immigration, and you try and unpick that a little bit. And one of the reasons they're anti-immigration is because my children can't get a council house. And then you say, well, the reason why your children can't get a council house is because huge numbers of them, particularly in wealthier areas, were sold off under right to buy, and no replacements were built. That wasn't caused by immigration. That was caused by government policies of failure to meet up to the needs. So, since you asked about immigration, very briefly, I'd say that the Green Party, we believe in a rights-based immigration policy. And one of the things that I'd hazard a guess will probably affect at least one person in this room if we keep our current policies, is there are at the moment, on the government's own figures, 18,000 British people who are unable to live with their spouse or partner in Britain because they don't meet the income requirements. And you have to be making, if you want to bring a foreign spouse into Britain, you're a British citizen, you went travelling for a year, you met a Japanese person or whatever, you have to be earning £18,000 a year to bring that person into Britain on a spousal visa. And their income doesn't count. They could actually be an investment banker who could earn £300,000 a year, but your income is the only one that counts. And we actually had a Supreme Court judge say this was grossly unfair and unreasonable. And we're actually stopping people, British people, having the right to live in their own country because of that. And the other thing about a rights-based immigration policy is Britain has a really proud tradition of offering asylum to people who've needed it because of political oppression. And I live in Somerstown, near the Somerstown Coffee House, which is where the Huguenot refugees in the 17th century used to gather and drink. And yet now we have an asylum system that when people who are left, who their original request for asylum is refused, they are left with no recourse to public funds. They usually have to struggle along homeless and living on charity, often for a couple of years. And those who do manage to appeal, 40% of their appeals are successful. So on appeal, it's shown that they did have good reason to get refugee status in Britain, but we initially refused it. So there's a lot wrong with our immigration policy. And the other thing that's worth saying about what's wrong with our immigration policy in terms of the immigration cap, which I'm sure will affect you'll at least be somewhat aware of, is they're including in the immigration cap foreign students. People who come here for a short term, do a course study, pay a large amount of money for the privilege, and yet they're including that in the immigration figures. So okay, housing and immigration. I could keep going longer, but I won't. Yep.
Can I just make a point of information, really? At the moment, we've got a real challenge on in Durham in terms of saving our green belt. And yesterday, a document was published called a Pre-Submission County Durham Plan. And in that, just linked to your question about housing, there is a plan to build 5,200 or plus actually houses in Durham City. And 4,000 of those are going to be on Greenbelt. So that's the challenge we have.
I mean, you know, I'd urge everyone to watch out for that and put some kind of submission in opposing it. I'm sure the Green Party will be doing it.
The County Durham Green Party will be preparing a formal response to that.
Good.
Yeah.
And I'll, help me prepare it. I'll be circulating it around and getting everybody's thoughts and ideas.
Yeah. And the other thing, just to comment very briefly in terms of building on Greenbelt, is that what you're usually talking about are very expensive homes with double car garages built for 2-car homes. And we are at or past peak oil. The price of oil is only going to keep going up. Those are going to be very expensive homes to live in and run in the future. And that's not the kind of housing we need. We need housing that's affordable to run, affordable to live in, close to public transport and all the rest. Okay. Yep, gentleman up the back.
Can I just say something about housing and the Green Belt? I've spent today doing work on the Green Party's response to the Newcastle Gateshead local development plan. It's worth looking at it online and looking at the maps. You will see huge allocations of land for new office blocks and for new retail parks. And yet, if people know Newcastle, even if you go across the Tyne Bridge to Swan House Roundabout, every office block there is empty, just as there are empty shops all over the area. Now, if you look at the Green Belt itself, companies like Persimmon are getting windfall profits the minute Green Belt status is removed. The value of that land shoots up. Persimmons and their ilk have done nothing. They've created no new wealth, and yet they are richer for that change in land designation. And the Green Party has policies like site value taxation to stop that happening. And the other 2 points I would really stress: if you give the developers access to the Greenbelt land, they've got even less incentive to do anything about brownfield sites. And the final point I would really stress, and it's worth looking at this, a lot of cities like Newcastle have got big ageing populations. Those people don't want to live on the edge of town in a big executive house. They want affordable housing in town, near the shops, near the doctor, near the friends, and they're the people who are being criminally neglected by council plans.
Yep, entirely agree. I don't think I can add to that. Usefully add to that. Okay, there were some more hands up before. I will allow male hands if you. Okay. Yep.
You mentioned earlier about how some people in the UK vote for their second least favourite party, and how I've personally found people who say I would have voted Green, but they would never get in. Do you think a change in electoral system in the UK could help make this fairer at all?
Yeah, it is worth starting off by saying that, of course, next year we have the European elections, which are proportional representation, and there's a poll out that shows for European voting attention puts us on 12%, which would treble our number of MEPs. But yes, there's so much wrong with the British electoral system. Where to start, really. We've actually got, some of you may know that Jenny Jones will be our first Green Lord in quite a long while, and she'll be going into the House of Lords on the 5th of November, which is a particularly telling date to be going into with the avowed intention of abolishing the place, because, they first started talking about an elected House of Lords 100 years ago. And you know, an elected House of Lords elected through PR would be a really good place to start. And in fact, the three largest parties went into the last general election with manifestos saying they would introduce an elected House of Lords during this Parliament. So they've absolutely crashed that manifesto, I promise. So, you know, the House of Lords is a really good place to start. With the Commons, we have the great problem of turkeys voting for Christmas. And that's the problem with the Commons. There's a really interesting possibility. Scotland has STV, basically, without going into complications, has basically a proportional system for local government, for councils. And I think because the three largest parties don't regard councils as terribly important, there's some real, and I've talked to the Electoral Reform Society about this, there's some real possibilities of trying to get a wedge in that way. So you've got the wedge of the House of Lords, which is basically unarguable. To have a hereditary House of Lords in 2013 is ridiculous. You've got the possibility of looking at local government. When you get to the Commons, then I think, you know, there are such powerful arguments when you look at what the turnout in elections like and how many people are disaffected in terms of the electoral system. It's going to take a real crunch point. It's going to take a point of people just recognising that things are going to blow apart if we don't fix this. But I think we can make real progress in the meantime on the Lords and on local government and keep up the pressure for a proportional representation system. And I really do think, I mean, if we had a system where for the Westminster Parliament you knew that your vote count, if the Green Party, say, gets, you know, about 10% of the votes, they get 10% of the seats, that really would transform British politics. So we've got to keep fighting and working for that, definitely. Yeah. Okay.
Climate change is like a really big thing at the moment. So what like policies do you have to try and reduce it like now and in the future?
Shirley mentioned our opposition to fracking, and British energy policy is a really important area in terms of which we really need action. You know, what we need to do, I'm going to start with the unsexy, unexciting stuff that no one ever talks about, which is energy conservation. Now, I'll bet that some of you in student housing, perhaps a bit less glorious than the castle, or maybe even the castle is quite drafty too, are in student housing that's pretty well impossible to heat, because student housing is particularly notorious for that. But actually, British housing is notorious across Europe for being really poor. We have some of the worst insulated homes in Europe. So actually, £1 in 4 of what we spend on home heating either goes straight up through an uninsulated ceiling or straight out through a drafty door or window. So, you know, we desperately need a really serious program of improving the quality, particularly of our houses, to cut energy use. But also, you know, I bet you can walk down the street here and see office blocks where all the lights are on right through the night. All kind of wastage that we have. We need to cut that as a starting point to cut our emissions. We need to then rely on renewable energy, invest in renewable energy. And you know, what all of these things do is they create jobs, cut carbon emissions and cut fuel poverty. So, you know, that's the energy system, and the kind of magic phrase, and I would urge you, if you have a pet lord or you'd like to adopt a pet member of the House of Lords, they're still considering the energy bill. And there's a magic phrase in the energy bill, which is decarbonisation by 2030, which is to say that we should have no carbon emissions for our electricity system by 2030. And if we did that, that would make a big chunk. Of course, we also then get to transport. You know, we need a much less car-based culture in terms of getting around. 57% of the car journeys in Britain are less than 5 miles. So in most cases, eminently walkable or cyclable. And, you know, we also have an obesity problem and a health inactivity problem. That would also tackle into that as well and cut our NHS bills. We need to, I was mentioning, you know, flying in beans from Peru and peas from Kenya. And, you know, 93% of the fruit that we eat in Britain is imported. Only 7% of it is grown here. And that's an issue, you know, not just in terms of emissions of all of the transport costs for that, but it's also an issue that about 2 years ago, the British currency dived against other world currencies, and the price of fruit leapt up. And the bottom 20% of people by income stopped eating fruit. So it's not just a carbon issue. So there's all those kind of transformations that we can make. And I think you'll probably encounter people, in fact, if you're talking about this in the student body, you'll get some people who are saying, but, you know, Britain's emissions as a share of the world aren't that great. And, you know, there's China building new coal-fired power stations and there's America puffing away why should we bother? Well, I think it's really important to take that issue on, because what you've actually got in places like China, even, and certainly America, you've got people in there fighting to really get them to take climate change seriously. Obama, a few months ago, actually declared carbon dioxide as a pollutant, which was a really, really big step for America. And if we take serious action, first of all, there's a moral point, because a large amount of the carbon in the atmosphere now was emitted by Britain because we industrialised very early, we've industrialised for a long time. But even more importantly for the future, if we take action, then we're empowering the people in China, in the US, in Brazil, in places all around the world to say, well, this is the right thing to do, this is the global action, let's all take it. So it's really important for Britain to take a lead on this, because we have a historic moral responsibility, and we also we should know enough to actually take some action. Okay. Okay, in the green up there.
Hi, how many candidates do you foresee having in 2015? Because I know I couldn't actually vote green.
In 2010, we hit a new record, which was slightly more than half of the constituencies. I can't tell you how many there'll be in 2015, because the Green Party works in a very different kind of way to other parties. We don't have a big centralised head office that moves the pawns around on the chessboard and goes, we'll go here and there, and you go there and you go there, and we'll parachute that person into that seat. Local parties in the Green Party are sovereign. The Green Party in Durham can decide what it wants to do with its time and resources and effort and candidates. I'm confident that we will be higher than that, but we were talking about electoral reform. There's one great barrier to this, which is a deposit of £500. And £500 to the Green Party, which doesn't get donations from big multinational tax avoiding companies and all the rest of it. £500 per constituency, you multiply 640 by £500, and it gets to a rather large sum of money quite quickly. So, we'd love to remove that £500 deposit to make sure we could stand everywhere. But what I also say is, lots of people think it's a bit scary to stand for Parliament. Maybe it is a bit scary sometimes to stand for Parliament, but when you look at the people we've got in there now, I think we could probably do a lot better. So, my suggestion to you would be to think about, wherever you are in 2015, think about whether you could be that candidate. Okay. Yep.
Just on that, I'm the returning officer for County Durham elections. We've actually opened nominations at this moment for prospective parliamentary candidates. If anybody's interested, if they can write their letters. It will be a selection, because I do know we've got enough people to actually have elections.
So a democratic process.
Yeah. So it's interesting actually. I was talking to a BBC reporter about our European election selections for our candidates for the European elections, and I really had to have about 3 goes at explaining to her that people put themselves forward and are nominated, and then the entire local party votes for them. And I said this to the BBC reporter, and she said, but you must shortlist and knock people off and, choose the ones you want. And it's like, no, everyone who stands goes into the ballot. And she went, but that's democracy. And I said, yes.
You voted for Jenny Jones.
Well, indeed, that's right, yes. We do have an elected, Jenny Jones is an elected House of Lords member, because she was selected by all Green Party members as the first person on our list. But, we're doing the best we can. We'd love to have a candidate everywhere, and I'll open this out to the whole room. Maybe you could be the candidate. Okay. In the blue, yeah.
In terms of energy policy, in New Zealand they had a scheme the Green Party ran, where they would insulate houses that didn't have insulation, and this rapidly decreases the costs for electricity. And it was also a scheme propped up by the government, so it created jobs and it helped out the poorest in society. Is that something that the Green Party here is looking at doing?
Very much so. I mean, it's an absolute disgrace that at the moment the government isn't spending a single penny of government money on actually insulating homes. And there was under the previous government, and sort of continued under this government, a scheme whereby energy companies were forced to insulate a certain number of homes. And I suppose we're not that far away from Huddersfield, And you can go to Huddersfield and see where about 55,000 homes that have been insulated basically because of one Green Party member. He's known as Mr. Insulation, Councillor Andrew Cooper, and he managed to sort of pull together all of that energy company money to do those 55,000 homes. But the fact there's not one penny of government money going into this now is absolute madness, and it's something we'd very much invest in. And as you say, it creates jobs, because even if you operate at the maximum pace you could possibly imagine of insulating homes, you've got decades worth of work in Britain. So it creates really good stable jobs, cuts carbon emissions, and the people in Huddersfield are each saving on average about £170 a year on their energy bills, which is definitely not to be sneezed at. Yeah, there was one. Yep.
On Saturday, The Economist published an article which basically stated that cities such as Hull should be abandoned because they have no future. I'm not sure if it was on the North, so I'm not sure if you'd say national outrage, but there's been, it's caused quite a bit of fuss. I was wondering what you thought on the issue.
Well, I think I've probably, in terms of what I was talking about HS2, already hinted at my response to this. And actually I was talking to the local paper and they were talking about Lord Howe and his views of the desolate north when he was talking about fracking, which I'm sure many people will be aware of. And we have a situation in far too much of our political class that's entirely London-centric. And, they think things should work like they do in London. And if they don't, they think they're dysfunctional. What we need to do is we have all of the resources, all of the people. And one of the things that the sort of nature of multinational globalised capitalism has tended to do is regard people as like, pawns that you can just move around. We want this terribly mobile labour where people can move wherever the jobs are. And that's entirely ignored the fact that actually people's lives are rooted in place very often. I mean, lots of us, well, some of us, like to move. If you're wondering, my accent comes from Australia originally. And that was my choice. I was lucky enough to have that option. But lots of people are born in a place, they have their lives embedded in a place, their friends live there, that's their community. And we need to make sure that we can make all of those communities work economically. And of course what we've also got is a huge amount of resources, embodied carbon, bridges, roads, facilities, hospitals, all of those things there. And we need to make sure every community that exists can be rebuilt where it needs to be rebuilt. And rebuild particularly the economies of those kind of places. And, the focus on London isn't any kind of inevitability. It's a result of government policies over decades. You think of the most recent case of PFI schemes that the former Labour government used to build lots of schools and hospitals at enormous cost. And all the PFI companies and the finance companies that supply them are all based in London. And so what you've actually got is the money flowing out of the north and the Midlands and the southwest into London. You have a different structure. That money stays when you build the local hospital, you use the local contractors, you employ local people. You have an entirely different kind of structure. So, I think we should rebuild Hull, not destroy it. Okay, right at the back.
We have a massive consumer culture in this country because everyone is always geared to buy the newest phone or iPad or everything. So what would you do to try and stop our thinking that way?
I think that is a huge problem, and we're all educated into it very early. I've forgotten the figures, but there's some amazing figures around about the number of adverts children see by the age 5, which is just some enormous figure. And there's all these studies that show that children recognise the McDonald arches before they practically recognise their mother's face. And what we actually passed a policy at the last Green Party conference that starts to tackle this, and I wouldn't claim this is any kind of total answer, that would basically ban advertising targeted at children under age 11. Now, of course you can't do that perfectly. Children watch adult programs and all the rest of it, but what that would do is ban advertising in programs meant for small children. It would ban the use of cartoon characters that appeal to small children. It would be an attempt to try and insulate children, because we actually know there's the psychological evidence that children until about that age find it very hard to distinguish between an advert and a news item. and they just really, it's very hard for them to understand that being told, this will make your life wonderful, is someone advertising to them. And so that, is a starting point. I think we also really need to look at the whole just utter pervasiveness and ubiquity of advertising. Wherever you go, you're just utterly bombarded with it. I was recently, it's ended now, thank goodness, but in London Tube for a while, you just had these rather disturbing, really, human-sized pint glasses of cider with, the water beading down the sides. And they just, there was just thousands and thousands, and wherever you went, there were these giant posters of cider. And, I don't often agree with Alistair Campbell, but, he's been pointing out that we have a huge alcohol problem in Britain, and maybe giant glasses of cider wherever you go, and it's really, really bad cider as well. If it's good cider, it may be different, but it's really, really horrible industrial stuff, is really not what we need. So I think we need to focus a lot on the advertising situation. And, I think there's something else about, there's a really interesting theory that's about compensatory consumption. People feel stressed, they feel poor, they feel like they're not really in control of their lives. But hey, you can go to Poundland and buy this enormously garish plastic thing for £1, and you'll feel a bit better for about 5 minutes, because you could go out and buy this big garish plastic thing which falls apart in the next week kind of thing. But, actually advertising and the whole consumer culture depends on keeping people unhappy. That's the whole basis of it. You're unhappy, you get this, you'll be happier. And we need to tackle that. Yep.
Europe. I've been watching what's been happening in, Greece in particular, Spain, Portugal, and to me, we need transnational solutions, environmental solutions bigger than any nation state. But what do you do? The suffering of the ordinary people, in countries where where the economy's going, it just feels to me like the European Union isn't any longer anything to do with social solidarity and countries looking after each other. If a country's having real problems, it seems to me it's prepared to just sell it down the river. Yeah. What do you think about it?
I think, the whole issue of austerity as opposed on Greece and Italy and Spain to some degree too. What we've had is an utter collapse of democracy. We've had imposed governments in those places, imposed solutions that, the Greeks in particular have resisted as strongly as they've been able to. And I think, I'm afraid I'm going to have to finish in a minute looking at the time and the trains, but, I think it's a good point to finish on. We have had a big collapse in democracy. There is not support for austerity in Britain, let alone in the rest of Europe. And we know these are the wrong directions. We actually have to invest in the future. We have to invest in the kind of things we've been talking about, renewable energy, home insulation. We've got to invest in education. We've got to invest in promoting and supporting new kind of industries, localised industry, all of those kind of things. And I come back to the point about the Fabian Society, and 67% of people believe that our economic model is broken. And yet we've got the three largest political parties that are simply, are offering us things like a 20-month energy price freeze, or cuts in fuel duty tax, or the married couple's tax allowance. So if you jump through a particular legal hoop, you get £200 a year. We absolutely must have big change in the way our politics, our economics, our society work. And we are going to have big changes because we can't stay where we are. We're not in a stable situation. So let's change them in a positive direction. Let's really rebuild a society that works for the people, an economy that works for people, not people working for the economy. Thank you.